You wake up to a breaking news alert. Government announces a $2 trillion stimulus package. Markets surge. Politicians hold press conferences. Experts appear on television promising recovery. This has happened before. In 2008, in 2020, in 2022. Every major economic crisis now follows the same script. The economy collapses. Governments borrow enormous amounts of money. They spend it into the system. And they tell you it's necessary. Necessary to protect jobs. Necessary to stabilize growth. Necessary to prevent collapse. And yet something strange keeps happening. The spending gets larger. The debts get higher. The crises get more frequent. After 2008, global government debt reached record levels. After COVID, it exploded again. And today, most advanced economies are more indebted than they've ever been in peacetime. The United States now owes more than $38 trillion. Japan's debt exceeds 250% of GDP. Europe runs permanent deficits even during economic booms. And still, recessions keep coming. So the question is no longer, can governments fix recessions? The real question is, why do governments keep using a tool that doesn't seem to work anymore? Because if fiscal policy actually solved the problem, we wouldn't still be here, running trillion-dollar deficits, hoping the next stimulus will finally be the one that works. For most of human history, governments didn't try to manage the economy at all. Recessions were seen as natural disasters, like earthquakes or famines, painful, unavoidable, and outside human control. If people lost their jobs, they suffered. If businesses failed, they disappeared. If economies collapsed, governments waited for recovery. That changed in the 1930s. The Great Depression didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed faith. Industrial production collapsed by nearly 30% in the United States. Unemployment reached 25%. Entire banking systems failed. For the first time, democratic governments faced a terrifying possibility that capitalism itself might collapse. It was during this moment that a British economist named John Maynard Keynes proposed a radical idea. He argued that recessions weren't natural disasters, they were failures of demand. When households stop spending and businesses stop investing, the economy enters a downward spiral. And the only actor large enough to break that spiral was the government. Keynes's solution was revolutionary. During recessions, governments should spend more than they collect, run deficits, borrow money, inject demand into the economy. And once growth returns, they can pay the debt back later. This idea became the foundation of modern fiscal policy, and for a while it worked. After World War II, Western economies experienced something unprecedented. Decades of stable growth, rising wages, expanding middle classes. Governments spent heavily on infrastructure, welfare, education, and housing, and growth remained strong. Fiscal policy became institutionalized, not emergency medicine anymore, but standard operating procedure. Whenever growth slowed, governments spent more, and for decades the bill seemed manageable. But beneath the surface, something fundamental was changing. The global economy was becoming more complex, more financialized, more interconnected, and fiscal policy was slowly losing the power it once had. By the time the 2008 financial crisis arrived, governments didn't hesitate. They deployed stimulus packages larger than anything in history. The United States passed an $800 billion rescue plan. Banks were bailed out. Central banks cut interest rates to zero. The economy recovered. But something felt different. Growth was weaker. Wages stagnated. Asset prices exploded. Stock markets recovered faster than jobs. Housing became unaffordable. Wealth concentrated in financial assets. Fiscal policy didn't fail, but it didn't fix the system either. It kept it alive. And that's the subtle shift most people missed. Governments stopped stabilizing capitalism and started life-supporting it. Japan shows what happens when fiscal policy becomes permanent. Since the early 1990s, Japan has fought stagnation with endless government spending. Infrastructure projects, public employment, massive budget deficits. The result? Japan now has the highest public debt in the developed world. Over $12 trillion, more than 250% of GDP, and yet economic growth remains weak. Fiscal policy didn't collapse Japan, but it didn't revive it either. It turned stagnation into a permanent condition. Japan didn't solve the problem, it learned how to live inside it. Then came 2020. The pandemic shut down the global economy overnight. Governments responded with unprecedented stimulus. The United States alone spent over $6 trillion. Europe followed. China injected liquidity. Central banks printed money at historic rates. Entire populations were paid to stay home. It worked. The economy survived. But the cost arrived later. Supply chains collapsed. Inflation exploded. Interest rates surged. The same policy that saved the system created the next crisis. Fiscal policy had become reflexive, not targeted, not strategic, just more spending every time the system broke. There are 5 structural reasons. Number 1, time lags. Fiscal policy moves woolly. By the time stimulus is approved, the recession is already changing. Governments fight the last crisis, not the current one. Number 2, political incentives. Politicians gain votes from spending. They lose votes from austerity, so deficits grow even during booms. Debt becomes permanent. Number 3, debt traps. As debt rises, interest payments dominate budgets. Fiscal policy becomes constrained by past decisions. Governments lose flexibility. Number 4, distribution effects. Stimulus flows first into financial markets, which benefits asset owners, not wage earners. Inequality deepens. Number 5, structural limits. Fiscal policy cannot fix demographic decline, productivity stagnation, technological disruption, global competition. It treats symptoms, not causes. Today, most governments are trapped. They cannot cut spending without unrest. They cannot increase spending without inflation. They cannot raise taxes without slowing growth. They cannot keep borrowing forever. Fiscal policy still exists, but it no longer controls the system. It merely delays consequences. Governments no longer manage growth. They manage decline. Every fiscal intervention leaves a footprint. That footprint is debt. In theory, this isn't a problem. Keynes himself argued that governments should borrow during recessions and pay it back during booms, but in practice, that second part never happens. Since the 1980s, almost every advanced economy has run permanent deficits, not just during crises, but during growth, during expansions, during record stock market rallies. The United States ran deficits during the dot-com boom, the housing bubble, the longest economic expansion in history. Debt didn't fall, it just grew more slowly. Then the next crisis arrived, and debt exploded again. This creates what economists call a debt ratchet. Debt rises during recessions, but never fully falls during recoveries. So every cycle starts from a higher base. In 1980, US federal debt was 30% of GDP. In 2000, it was 55%. In 2008, 65%. After COVID, over 120%. Japan crossed this threshold decades ago. Europe followed after the Euro crisis. Emerging markets are now entering it. At some point, debt stops being a temporary tool and becomes the structure of the system itself. The economy doesn't run on growth anymore. It runs on rollover. Borrow to pay old debt. Borrow more to stabilize the system. Borrow again to manage the consequences of borrowing. This is not fiscal management. This is debt maintenance. Debt only stays manageable under one condition: low interest rates. For most of the last 15 years, governments benefited from historic anomaly, near zero interest rates. The cost of borrowing collapsed, which made debt feel harmless. But interest rates are not controlled by fiscal policy. They're controlled by inflation, markets, and central banks. And when inflation returned in 2021, that illusion ended overnight. The US government now pays more in interest than it spends on national defense. Japan spends over 25% of its tax revenue just servicing debt. Italy spends more on interest than on education. This creates the interest rate trap. When rates are low, debt seems cheap. When rates rise, debt becomes a crisis. So governments face an impossible choice: raise rates to fight inflation and trigger a debt crisis, or keep rates low and allow inflation to erode purchasing power. Either way, someone pays. This is where fiscal policy becomes political, because every solution creates a different kind of pain. Option 1, austerity cuts spending, raise taxes, balance budget Bs. This reduces debt, but it also shrinks the economy, raises unemployment, triggers protests, destroys political careers. Greece tried austerity after 2010. The result, GDP collapsed by 25% and youth unemployment exceeded 50%. Public services disintegrated. Debt fell slowly. Society broke quickly. Option 2, inflation, print money, devalue the currency. Let prices rise. This reduces debt in real terms, but it also destroys savings, erodes wages, punishes the poor, destabilizes politics. Argentina chose inflation, Turkey chose inflation, Lebanon chose inflation, debt shrank. So did trust. This is the fiscal dilemma. Austerity destroys growth. Inflation destroys money. Fiscal policy cannot escape this trade-off. It can only choose which group absorbs the cost. Nowhere is this more visible than in emerging markets. Countries without reserve currencies cannot borrow endlessly. They face a harder constraint: foreign capital. When investors lose confidence, capital exits, currencies collapse, debt becomes unpayable. This is what happened to Mexico in 1994, Asia in 1997, Russia in 1998, Argentina in 2001, Turkey in 2018, Sri Lanka in 2022. Each case followed the same pattern. Government borrows heavily, runs deficits, stimulates growth. Eventually markets panic, currencies fall, debt explodes in local terms. IMF arrives. Fiscal policy ends in external control. The irony is brutal. Fiscal policy is supposed to protect sovereignty, but excessive fiscal policy destroys it. Europe shows the long-term version of this trap. After the euro crisis, European governments imposed fiscal rules, debt limits, deficit caps, austerity frameworks. The result? Debt stabilized. But growth disappeared. Southern Europe entered a lost decade. Italy's economy today is barely larger than it was in 2000. Spain's youth unemployment remains above 30%. France runs permanent deficits. Germany's growth model collapsed. Europe avoided collapse. But it never recovered. Fiscal policy didn't fail. It simply produced low-growth equilibrium. Stability without prosperity. Supporters of modern monetary theory argue something different. They say governments that control their own currency can never run out of money. They can always print more. Debt doesn't matter. Deficits don't matter. The only real constraint is inflation. In theory, this is correct. In practice, it fails for one reason: politics. Governments are very good at printing money. They are very bad at reversing it. No politician wants to cut spending during inflation. So MMT works in textbooks, but collapses in elections. Zimbabwe wasn't constrained by money, it was constrained by reality. Every government eventually reaches the same point. Debt is too high to cut. Inflation is too dangerous to ignore. Growth is too weak to generate tax revenue. So they choose the only viable option: delay, roll as debt. Extend deficits, manage instability. Fiscal policy becomes crisis management, not solution. Governments no longer ask, how do we fix the system? They ask, how do we keep it from breaking this year? Once debt reaches a certain scale, fiscal policy stops being domestic. It becomes geopolitical, because large deficits must be financed by someone, and increasingly that someone is foreign capital. The United States runs deficits that no domestic savings pool can absorb. So foreign governments, pension funds, and institutions buy US Treasury bonds. China holds over $800 billion. Japan holds over $1 trillion. Europe holds trillions more. This means American fiscal policy is partially financed by geopolitical rivals. And that creates a structural vulnerability, because if foreign demand weakens, interest rates rise. And when interest rates rise, the entire fiscal model collapses. This is why fiscal policy is now entangled with diplomacy, sanctions, and trade wars. The dollar is no longer just a currency, it is a funding mechanism. And that mechanism depends on trust. Sanctions were supposed to strengthen the system. Instead, they accelerated its erosion. When the US froze $300 billion of Russian foreign reserves in 2022, it sent a signal to every central bank on Earth. Foreign reserves are not neutral, they are political assets, and political assets can be seized. Since then, central banks have been diversifying, buying gold, reducing dollar exposure, building alternative settlement systems, not because they hate the dollar, but because they no longer trust it. This creates the fiscal paradox. The more the US weaponizes finance, the less global demand there is to finance US deficits. Fiscal dominance requires cooperation. But modern geopolitics destroys cooperation. We are now entering a multipolar debt system. Not one dominant creditor, not one dominant currency, but competing fiscal empires. The US runs deficits, China runs industrial subsidies, Europe runs welfare states, Japan runs permanent stagnation, everyone borrows, no one reforms. Global debt now exceeds $300 trillion, 3 times global GDP. This is not a growth model, it is a fragility model. The system survives not through productivity, but through confidence, and confidence is not a policy tool. This is the final transformation. Fiscal policy no longer exists to create prosperity, it exists to prevent collapse. Stimulus doesn't aim to improve lives, it aims to stabilize expectations, keep people consuming, keep markets calm, keep institutions solvent. Growth becomes secondary. Stability becomes everything. This is why recessions no longer end. They fade into low growth plateaus. Permanent stimulus, permanent debt, permanent emergency, the system never resets, it just drifts. Keynes believed in a soul, deficits during crises, surpluses during booms, but modern economies never enter the surplus phase. Politics makes it impossible. Voters demand spending. Markets demand stability. Demographics demand welfare. So deficits become structural. And fiscal policy loses its original logic. It becomes a way to hide structural stagnation, a way to postpone adjustment, a way to shift pain forward in time. Governments cannot fix recessions because recessions are no longer the problem. The problem is the system itself. Low productivity, aging populations, debt saturation, geopolitical fragmentation. Fiscal policy cannot solve these. It can only delay their consequences. It is not a cure, it is anesthesia. Fiscal policy was supposed to stabilize capitalism. Instead, it revealed something far more uncomfortable, that modern economies are too complex, too indebted, and too politically constrained to be managed through spending alone. Governments can soften crashes. They can buy time. They can prevent immediate collapse. But they cannot design prosperity. Because prosperity is not created by budgets. It is created by millions of independent decisions, made far away from government offices, outside political cycles, beyond fiscal models. Fiscal policy doesn't control the system anymore. It just keeps it breathing. And that's the quiet truth of the modern world. We are no longer managing growth. We are managing decline. The real question isn't whether the next stimulus will work. It's how many times we can repeat the same solution before we admit the problem was never the recession. It was the system we built to prevent